Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pete Candler. I'm a writer and photographer based in Asheville, North Carolina. And I write about the practice of memory and forgetfulness in the American South at adeepersouth.com. The vision of a deeper South is rooted in the idea that the spiritual, political, and cultural health of a nation, region, city, town, or person depends upon an honest and unflinching memory. That the gravest danger to our cities and ourselves is a willful amnesia. That hope is to be found through the work of active remembrance, putting back together the fragments of personhood scattered by a culture of selective memory. I'm really excited today to welcome two women I've been following for a while and learning from in these last months. Adena White and Kara Wilkins, who are two, I think, the hosts. There are others involved, and we'll shout out to them too, of the award-winning podcast, Blackbelt Voices, which, if you read Oprah Magazine, which I think is everybody, right? You will have seen that Blackbelt Voices was named as one of the 15 best educational podcasts for you to expand your mind recently. And so congratulations to you both, and to Katrina Dupins, who's also involved with the podcast producing and writing for the website. She can be here with us today, but I'm really glad to have both of you here, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting conversation about what you all do. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Blackbelt Voices, this is how Adena and Kara describe their work. Blackbelt shares stories from and about Black folks down South. Too often, Southern culture, in quotes, is limited to the experiences of white Southerners, such as the Confederacy, country music, and monograms. Although more than half of Black Americans live in the South and have contributed greatly to the Southern way of life we hold so dear, we are often omitted from the South's larger narrative. Blackbelt propagates the richness of Black Southern culture by telling the stories of Black folk down South. Through first-person narratives and in-depth conversations, hosts Adena White, Kara Wilkins, and Katrina Dupins share the experiences of Black Southerners living in, loving, and reconciling with the region we call home, which is just wonderful. I love the description of what you do, and it's so realized, so powerfully realized in your writing and your the podcast that you do. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to get involved with the podcast and what the story behind that was. What was there a moment that sort of made you to say, this is something we need to do?
Yeah, and I'll start us off by saying thanks for having us, Pete, on the Deeper South. And John, it's an honor to be here. And before I start on with the story, I want to let Kara chime in if she wants to say anything, because it's not a long story, but I can ramble.
No, my only piece is thank you as well. I'm really excited to be here, and whatever Adena says, you can just add on. She just told me to come, and I showed up. So that's my contribution to the podcast.
So it was 2016, and that's not when we started it, but like after the election, I felt like I wanted to do some more. I went to the Women's March, and in 2015, after the Charleston 9 were massacred in South Carolina, I even then I wanted to do more than what I was doing. But like, I think 2016 was kind of like that trigger moment. So I was like, I have to do something, but I'm not really on the ground type activist. I'm not really a policymaker, so I don't understand a lot of this stuff. So what I do is I communicate professionally and I write and I work in PR. So I'm like, how can I tie that into my way of helping? So around April of 2017, I got the idea to focus on Black Southerners because during the election, you heard a lot of like, you just heard so much dog whistles every time like law and order was mentioned or anything, which that's kind of happening now too. But um, you would hear when they talked about Black people, it was like urban areas, Chicago. And then when they talked about Southerners, it was always, oh, the South, like liberal people in the North would be like, let's throw the whole South away. They voted for Trump. Oh, let's get rid of the South. And it's kind of like, well, you have a lot of Black people who live here that you say you care about. So you're leaving us out. So I wanted to do more to tell our story. So of course, my first thought as someone who writes and professionally was to start a blog. I'm a few years late on that, but anyway. So I just met with different people who also work in PR here in Arkansas. Different Black people. Kara was one of them. Some more people who I respect and just kind of got their feedback and just talked to me about the idea. And everyone was very supportive and encouraging. But of course, I was kind of late getting started. And then Kara would follow up with me on time to time. So I did one story with someone who will be on the podcast in a couple of weeks. Her name is Charlene Oliver. She's from Nashville. So she was the first Black Belt blog post. And on the phone, as I was taking notes for the interview, she cried about a story that she was telling about her mom and how her mom was going to school and working and taking care of the family. And she was just very emotional. And I was like, this will be great audio. But I'm an introverted person, not a big talker. So I was like, I can't do a podcast, but so let's just forget about that. And in my head, I was like, I need a co-host if I were to do it. So one day, Kara and I were having coffee here in Conway, and then Black Belt came up again, and she was asking how it was going. And then we're just talking, and she was talking about probably Beyonce or something like that. And then I was like, would you like to co-host a podcast? And she was like, yeah, sure. So this was, at this point, it was like 2018. So like a whole year has gone by, finally it's starting to happen. And then my sister and I, we regularly talk about, our side hustles, our career ambitions outside of our normal jobs. Like she works in PR as well, but she has a journalism background and she loves photography and writing. So she was going to help with Black Belt on the blog, and we were talking about it. She said, I'm a producer looking for a show. And I said, oh, guess what? Black Belt's going to be a podcast now. Would you like to produce it? And she was like, yeah, sure. And then so I had this idea of how I wanted the music to sound like. I wanted like lift her voice and sing with trap music. And then her husband, Prentice, is a musician. And so he was eager to help write it. So he wrote our intro song. He composed it, the intro music and the outro music. And so once we had all that going, it was easier to get started. A friend of ours who I work with, Leo Cummings, he has a podcast called Black Dude, White Dude that he co-hosts with his friend. He has a nice studio set up in his garage. He let us borrow his studio. And so by September of 2019, we had our first episode out. And so that was, it was a long time coming, but like it was great. And our first season lasted from about September through early March. And so it ended right before the pandemic. So we had time to kind of just like get used to this new normal. And we kicked back off for it with season 2 in September. So yeah, so that's the story. It was, I mean, very slow getting started, but we've been very excited about the excitement around it. Like that's been surprising.
Kara, do you have anything did she get the story right?
She definitely got the story right. And I think, the only thing to add is kind of what we left off on, which is that we were not anticipating anything of this magnitude in terms of Oprah or magazines or anything. To Adena's point, we started this in a garage and we were just talking about our experiences and the experiences of our family members and people that we knew in Arkansas who had all of these great and wonderful stories to tell, but maybe didn't have a platform to do it. And so it literally is a labor of love. It is, there was no plan of action behind it. And I think that surprises a lot of people because they're always asking me and Adena, like, why don't you have this? Or, why don't you do sponsors? And why don't you do whatever? And it's like, well, that just wasn't in our mind. Like, I mean, now it kind of is, but at the time we were just like, we just want to talk and we want to let other people talk and we want to communicate and tell these stories. And so I just really think that a lot of times, a lot of our success is because we're just very authentic with it. It just, there never really was like a plan of like, we're going to take over the world with our podcast. But
well, I kind of do have that plan, but I work full time and have a toddler, so it's slow, but it's in there.
Well, I mean, there's something very refreshing about it, because it does feel very authentic and very much, like it grows out of y'all's friendship and your shared background in a way in Arkansas. And it doesn't, I mean, one of those one of those podcasts that you're talking about when you hear it, the kind that sets out from the beginning to, we're going to change the world and be number one on Apple Podcasts. And it feels like, sitting in on a conversation in your living room, maybe. I know y'all talk a lot about front porches too, so maybe on the front porch. I have to point out a couple things. I mean, you've mentioned the music, which I love, and I think, if I'm hearing right, the opening song is from, is it Sweet Honey in the Rock? Is it a recording of Sweet Honey in the Rock of Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around?
Yeah, and that is the song, but I didn't know what's from that. So that's good to know. We need to dive into that a little more.
Ask Prentice maybe, but
yes.
I heard them in college once, and this is kind of a Deeper South story a little bit, because in terms of you never know what, you get a performer who shows up on stage, and Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was one of the voices in Sweet Honey in the Rock, was still the single most powerful voice I have ever heard singing voice. Incredible. And only later, really actually not that long ago, did I realize that she had been a big part of the civil rights movement in Albany in the early 1960s. So here I had no idea the person in whose presence I was fortunate enough to be at the time. So every time I hear your intro, I'm sort of taken back to that moment. But the other thing I wanted to point out is your logo, which I think is one of the coolest logos I've ever seen. I may have a little logo envy, but how did that come about? I mean, that was just ingenious. It was on, if you haven't seen it, it's on the little sort of poster thing that we sent out.
I've worked with this graphic designer who we've become good friends for 12 years now. I mean, like through my whole career, pretty much. So we worked together at our last job, and then she left there, started going on her own, and now this current job that I've been at for 9 years, she started as a contract person, now she's part-time. So anyway, we worked together forever. So she knew about Blackbelt. She whipped me up a logo in about 5 minutes. That was just like the name, and when I told her the idea, and we used that for when it was still a blog. But then when I got more serious, I approached her, and all I said was like a cotton ball mixed with an afro and some earth tones, because like the whole soil story, so I want earth tones. Anyway, she comes back with that, and yeah, she's super talented, and like she exceeded what I even had in mind. Like, yeah. So she took some basic instructions and just made something that we're all very proud of.
Yeah, she nailed it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is maybe a little bit inside baseball, but when you got the logo, did it make you feel a sense of like all right, this is real thing now. It's like give a kind of visual sort of grounding to what you're trying to do, and that you can sort of return back to, or something like that. Does that make any sense? It's kind of,
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
what I'm saying? I sort of resisted like all of the logos and websites and all that. I'm not doing that. You know, I'm a
Yeah,
writer.
right.
I
Right,
don't.
yeah, yeah. And
um,
like, and see, I'm the, like, I do
yeah,
PR and communication, so people call me a writer. I'm like, oh, I'm not a writer. I just do it.
yeah,
But I realized I never said her name. Her name is Kara Darling, and her company is Kara Darling Creative. So,
yeah.
and
Well,
it's a great name too, Darling. Isn't that just
yeah,
so nice? But yeah, it did feel like, because in my head, like once the logo came, it was like, okay, this will be merchandise. I do drag my feet on stuff, but that is in my head, like, you know, getting it trademarked, getting merchandise sold. Um, so yeah, it does make you, because it's something that's not just about us. It's like it can represent this region, I feel like. So I think it's a good representation that we can all have, and hopefully one day, not to make it like a Confederate flag, but you know, like that's something that represents kind of like the white South, the
yeah.
cultural South. It's fading, but you know, so now this thing, and not that it doesn't have to be this thing, but like I like having a representation of where we come from.
Of an alternative, yeah.
Mm.
I mean, the power of the visual is really so strong. I mean, it's you can't underestimate how something like a your logo just signals something to people, draws them in a way. That's certainly what happened to me. Um, but the way you described the the genesis moment of Blackbelt Voices in 2016 and 2017, by seeing the way both Black Americans are represented in the media typically, and then uh, Southerners are typically represented in the media. Um, I mean, we saw this as recently as the last debate when the subject of race in America came up. It immediately became a conversation about crime. And this has got to be incredibly frustrating, but it also, like, not surprising given what we know about American history and politics. But in what y'all are doing, you're pushing back against not just a sort of a widely held cultural perception of Black Americans, but also at the same time against a sort of cultural prejudice, if we can call it that, against Southerners. And, you're working at both of these at the same time, which is it's almost Herculean project to try to. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, how receiving these messages from the culture or the media prompted you to say, no, that's not the story, or in a way it prompted you to want to do something to correct the received narratives.
Well, I think earlier, when we talk about shifting the narrative, we really were just thinking about all of the people, again, that we know who have these compelling stories. And I don't think, it was it was our intention to share these stories, but I don't think it was our intention to we did want to shift the counterculture, but that really wasn't the goal. Was like, how do we help these people have a place where they can talk about whatever's going on? It just so happened that a lot of the work then goes into shifting the narrative about the South, right? So the idea of, for example, one of our guests talked a little bit about land rights and land and farmers and the history of, you know, how farmland was taken from Black Southerners. That's understood. That's history. That's what has happened. But then getting into the nuances of the families who've lived through this, or getting into the generational effects of the families who are still around, who are dealing with the fact that wealth was extracted from their communities or wealth was extracted from their families. That was really kind of the story. And I think that helps people to look a little bit deeper, and that's where the narrative shift happens, right? Because then it becomes a little bit less about, and not less about, but it moves away from the common narrative, again, that's history that anybody can go read and anybody can go look up, to, no, here's the impact, right? Like, here's this family 50 years later who is still experiencing generational poverty or doesn't have, you know, the land ownership rights or whatever. So to me, that's where I think the shift happens, is that you're getting into the nuances of how this is reality, and it takes it a little bit off of history books. And I'm a history major, by the way, too. So John, when you said that earlier, I was like, whoop, whoop. And so for me, it's, you know, it's about putting it in real time and helping people to understand. And I think that's where that shift in culture and understanding how Southerners, understanding our impact kind of works. I don't know if that makes sense, but it did totally in my head. Sense. So
it does. And I was going to add to that, like, some inspiration, early inspiration came from like those Southern publications, like Bitter Southerner, when they were still, before it became a podcast, them, Scalawag Magazine. Like, I was following their work along with Blavity and For Harriet, more of the Black focused media. So some of the Black influencers I really like, you know, a lot of them aren't based here. They're based in the bigger cities. And then, you know, and one woman I follow, she was rattling off some cities talking about Black people, and none of them were in the South. You know, she's like LA, Chicago, New York. And I was like, you know, so as a Southerner, I was kind of like, where are we? So it's kind of like on both ends. So I think inspiration came from like those Southern progressive publications like Bitter Southerner and Scalawag, and then also the millennial Black leaning websites. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Kara made a good point. It's about telling stories from different perspectives to kind of, you know, get the full picture of things.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, you know, it's one thing to have the statistics of, say, the likeliness of Black men to be murdered by police versus white men for the same crime, for example. But to have like the reality of that statistic fleshed out in a true story of an actual flesh and blood human being is different. I mean, that's a you know, these are the stories that we don't often hear in the nightly newscast or whatever. That these are even in an election like this one that is so, you know, important and contentious and all the rest. We don't hear that much about like the reality of how these big issues affect specific human lives. And that's one of the things I love about your work, is that it's, you know, the attention is always on the ground, so to speak. Like, what difference does this actually make to a person's life? I wondered if you could tell, and I want to give folks in here who haven't maybe listened to y'all much yet an idea of the range of subjects you cover. And I think that's one of the really impressive things about the podcast and the website and the writing that goes with it. In 2019, in the first season of the of the show, you covered subjects from HIV testing and education, interior design, lynching, the United States Census, property laws, black hair, your grandmother, or Adena, your grandmother, your and Katrina's grandmother, Classy Hawkins, who just turned 100 last year. And then the story of Marvin Leonard Williams. And I was wonder if you could tell a little bit of that story too, because this is a story from 1960 that about Marvin Leonard Williams was a Black Army and Navy veteran who in 1960 was, correct me if I get the details of this wrong, arrested on some very dubious charge, and then during his time in jail was beaten and murdered by police who attributed his death to falling on some stairs, I think, if I remember that right. And then his brother 25 years later looks back into this case and discovers the official story was not the truth. Could you tell a little bit about the story of Marvin Leonard Williams and how you came to discover that story?
Yes, I work full-time at the Conway Chamber of Commerce. And Ronnie Williams, the brother of the man who was killed in police custody, he's like in higher education administration at the University of Central Arkansas, which is like our big 4-year public university here. So he's well known, well respected throughout the community. And a few years ago, he told that story to our CEO and our executive vice president, because they're friends too. He remembers them when they were in college. So he told them the story, and they were just shocked. And so I had heard bits and pieces of the story, but I never approached him about it, of course. But then when we started with the podcast, they were telling me, like, you need to get Ronnie on there. And one day Ronnie called me to congratulate. No, I thought he called me to congratulate me on some local news feature, just on a personal level. But he said, I'm working on a book and I want you to help me edit it. And it was the book that he's working on about his brother, which is actually, I think, at the publisher now. Like he's making some good strides. But anyway, I told him I would. And he said, do you edit books? I was like, I did once, but I mean, I can help you any way you can. So anyway, later on, once we got more attention on Apple Podcasts and our audience grew, we're like, okay, the time is right to ask him. And so he was willing to share a story, and it was very humbling that he shared that with us, because at that time, since 1984, when like it got a little national attention after Bill Clinton reopened the case into his brother's death. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas at the time. He hadn't really spoken about it much, and he was very bitter about this town of Conway. So we were just so glad he came to tell it, and that's how I learned of it. And the story itself is just like, it doesn't even seem real, because the night his brother died, there was also a tornado in their hometown, which destroyed their house. And Ronnie, who was 7 at the time, had to go to the hospital for a head injury. And the next day they found out that his brother died, and all they knew was that he died. 25 years later, the family gets a letter from a white inmate who was there that night saying, I can't live like this. I had to let you know what I saw, what I heard. He was away. The cells were segregated, so he didn't see it, but he heard the officers beating his brother. And the autopsy results confirmed it. I think they exhumed his body and stuff, which I don't think I was clear on that when we talked to him. But he recently spoke at a minority business event we had here as a chamber last week. So he's telling his story a little more. And it's just really a powerful story. And I really hope his book does well, because like it deserves to be told, because he's someone that is so well known and so well respected here. And you think that it makes that story of police brutality hit home and lets people know how long it's been going on. Like, I think we all know that, but I mean, this was in the 60s. It was covered up for 25 years. In the 80s, the police were acquitted. Like, I mean, I'm not really ruining the story by saying that, but like he kind of paints a good picture about like all the evidence pointed to an acquittal, not an acquittal, but like to convict. But yeah, it's just fascinating. I really hope to maybe get him back on when his book comes out.
So you're kind of learning this story while at the same time, national headlines are about basically the same story over and over again. Like
Yeah.
you're repeating the story of Marvin Leonard Williams. And so what was that? What was the kind of that must have had a pretty heavy emotional impact with these two kind of coming together.
It really did, because he had been working on the book for about 4 or 5 years now. So like I knew of it, but like when our podcast came out, that was kind of before, George Floyd. So it was still happening, but it wasn't like, it didn't come to a head like it did this summer. But it was very, it just made it that more relevant. And like I remember when my sister, she previewed the audio for me. We were in my car and she played the audio before it went live. And I just started crying, like when the opening music came on, like, I mean, because it was just knowing that like it's such an important story and that we were the ones able to tell it. And also just like what he's been through and how these old wounds are opening back up right now, And so he will tell you like he wasn't in a good place when all that happened. And he's learned to kind of, you know, forgive, but also like not forget either. Like he's listing names in his book. Like he's not holding back and saying, he's letting it all out there. And there's, our town is about 70,000, 65, 70,000. So there's some names in there that their family is still around. So.
Well, they're the county judges, they're the politicians, they're the business leaders. It does, again, going back to earlier, it has those generational impacts. And I know when I hear about, I see a lot of connections between Ronnie's story and Breonna Taylor in terms of the police, the cover-ups that come out afterwards, like all of those things. It's the same story, just 30 years apart. And that's scary. That's scary for me, because then it's like, well, what have we done and how far have we actually come, other than now we have social media to help tell that story that Ronnie didn't have, back in the 80s. So now we're just literally seeing it on our front steps every day, but it's been going on. And it's, again, it's, and that's something that people have said to me is like, I didn't know that was happening in the 60s, or I didn't know. So the podcast has been very effective in kind of pulling those threads together.
And the other thing that's so powerful about the way you tell this story is like, this is not something that's happening in Minneapolis. Like, this is your town. This is somebody that you have interacted with, that and has been carrying this story around his entire life. And the proximity of the story and yet the hiddenness of it is what's so, I think, illuminating, because it suggests that we're all in some kind of proximity to a similar story, and a much greater proximity than we realize. And either like geographically, or in terms of family history, or in terms of, whatever, that there is a story like Marvin Leonard Williams in our neighborhood that we don't know about. And that we, and even that we may have had some sort of complicity in too, which is the other part of it that, especially for white people, that is, is incredibly difficult to confront.
I just really quickly to that point, Pete, I recently met a woman whose dad was the school superintendent at the time of the Central High crisis, and talked about Orville Faubus, who was the governor at the time, who called the National Guard out on the Little Rock Nine, would have dinner at their house. And she called him Uncle Orbit. I mean, you know, like it was that. So in her head, she said it wasn't until way later that she could recognize like, like this was, because in her head, now that she's thinking about it, she's like, a lot of the meetings about, you know, segregation and other things happened in her living room, in her dining table. I mean, because it was just, so when you talk about proximity, I mean, and she's a wonderful woman. I mean, she's great, but it is in our backyards. It is in our face. It is, you know, right there. And I was even struck by her conversation because she just was like, this was normal. Like, this is just like normal conversation that we had at our house. And it didn't strike her until being wrong until she got to like college away from Arkansas. And she read in the history books about it. And she was like, oh, is that a bad thing? People were like, yes, girl. Yeah. So it's fascinating. It really is.
I think, you know, oh, sorry, John.
Just real quick, I confess I have not listened to those episodes yet, and I definitely will this evening. But for the past couple of years here in Augusta, I've been working on recovering the story of a 1970 event. That what you're describing about Conway in 1960, the parallels are just eerie. So I will definitely listen to that and follow up with you, perhaps with an email. But eerie parallels. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Pete.
And it's while we're at it and we're on the podcast thing, there's a podcast devoted to the work that John has been involved with called, is it Shots in the Back? Which Cis Datura, the colleague of John's in Augusta there, is put together with the help of Georgia Public Broadcasting, I think. And so we're trading podcasts here. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. You got the proximity too, John, but that was like, John, the way you've described that too, when you showed up in Augusta, like this wasn't front and center. Like it wasn't, you learned about it in the details about it later. And I think after a lot of research, but this is one thing that, I mean, I don't know if this is a broader cultural phenomenon right now, but it does seem there was a reference to this in one of your episodes on that. The podcast is called Piquing Your Interest in the Past. And Brian, Brian Mitchell.
Mitchell, yes.
Brian Mitchell, professor there in Arkansas, was talking about how we all grew up with this version of American history. And it's a version that's, you know, great white men did a series of great things. And it's a pretty triumphalist sort of narrative. We all imagine Washington crossing the Delaware heroically, standing in the bow of a ship, which never happened. But these sort of nuggets of American history have lodged in the collective consciousness so firmly that this year we're seeing how much resistance there is to unlearning that, or to an alternative that, or not even an alternative, just a version that says, well, wait, this is not the full picture, or there's a whole section of this story that's being left out. So I'm curious to know for both of you and I'll read the quote from Dr. Mitchell, who said, "We've grown up hearing the narrative that America wants to teach, that America was founded by great white men and everybody else are just supporting characters in this narrative." I know that that's the version that I got growing up. Was that the version that you got too? Or what were were there ways in which you got it in one sort of official way, but maybe there were resources that that kind of questioned that narrative?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the narrative I got, and Kara can speak more on her experience as a history major, but like that's what I always heard. My husband is actually an American history major, got his degree in history, so I don't know how much of that he actually was exposed to, but we would have Black History programs at church, during Black History Month. So, but I did like in 7th or 8th grade, I wrote a little article on like inventors. It was probably plagiarized when I think about it, because I read it somewhere else and just redid it myself. So I'm like, anyway, but I won like a McDonald's essay contest because I talked about that. You've probably seen it. The stoplight was invented by a Black man, and and so it was kind of play on that. Anyway, that was kind of my extent of American history. It was kind of like, oh, there's Black people who did cool things too. Look how far we've come. And not really interrogating what I was being taught. That came later. I mean, and I'm still working on that. So even looking at Black history, it wasn't like as a way to, it was kind of like supplemental. It's like, oh, well, here's some more cool stuff. It wasn't like questioning what we've been taught, or like, and I always like to think about the people who get the passive voice treatment, like not just in history, but anywhere, like, oh, I don't know, like when this country was built or whatever, and just kind of leaving out who did it, So just those kinds of things, you just have to like think about who's missing. And like the historians know all about this, but like that's new for me. I mean, I didn't have that knowledge of interrogating that kind of thing. So it's all very, I'm learning a lot myself.
For me, it's funny because I went to a majority white college where it was probably 1,000 students and 30 of us were Black. I mean, the whole 4 years that I was there. And so I started off as a general history major because I like all types of history. And I actually wanted to get away from the narrative that Black people have to only do African-American history, right? I'm really into European history. It's something that's my passion. But as I was going through some of the classes and the work, I was like, these stories are not fully fleshed out. And I mean, you can even look, I know one of our podcast guests that is like on our list, if Adena and I have a list, is Angie Maxwell, who talks about the long Southern strategy and talks about how, DAR went into schools and changed the textbooks and made sure that after the Confederates, after the Civil War, that a lot of the narrative was championing, to your point, Pete, telling the story from white men and how, they were successful and worked hard and did all this. And so you still see that. You still see that years later. You see, I graduated in 2005, and that was still a lot of our books. And so for me, that's what made the shift to be like, I really need to focus on African-American history, also knowing that there aren't a lot, and Dr. Brian Mitchell talks about this, there aren't a lot of Black professors. There definitely aren't a lot of Black tenured professors. And then when you get a tenure job, people die out of those positions. So it was important, even though I ended up not going into that field per se, but it was important to me to be able to say to people, well, maybe that's different, or maybe the way you were taught is different. And I think the 1619 Project really has brought that back to the forefront. And I'm sure you guys have seen one of our Arkansas legislators was very keenly against that and keenly against it being taught in schools, and has gone on the warpath and has been in the New York Times talking about that. And again, going back to it being a small town, I can't even say his name on here because I don't know if like his people will come after me afterwards. You said what?
Southern plant, I believe. Is that?
Yes. So it has something to do with, yeah. So, but my point is, like, we're in 2020, 2019, and people are still resistant to any other type of teaching of history and the background. And I mean, the 1619 Project is very well vetted, very well vetted. I mean, this is not something that somebody came off the street and said, well, here, read this and see if that works for you. So the fact that, like, we can have scholars who are working on this, who are doing the work, who are saying, let's unpack this, let's really dig deeper into how we're teaching our kids this or what it's in our textbooks, and people are still resistant to it because they know the impact and the importance of someone learning something and having it embedded in their mind, whether they're Black, white, whatever. Because there's a lot of Black people who have a lot of inherent biases in work that we have to do because of the way you were taught history, right? You're not taught that we did this or we rose above. You're taught, well, Black people came and they worked really hard. And I mean, you have some folks who are now talking about, like, slavery was a indentured servitude and a choice for I mean, like, that is being talked about in some history books, and it's wrong, right? So if we can't all agree on the facts, then what do we have to hold us morally accountable?
Yeah, and it's interesting and instructive that the 1619 Project was so, I mean, it certainly touched a nerve so deep that the White House itself felt it necessary to sponsor an event and a subsequent commission in order to undermine this, as if it was propaganda being put forward by leftist, university professors who we know are all secret Antifa agents, But if you, and I actually, against my better judgment, maybe watched the majority, as much as I could take, of the actual event in the Library of Congress when the White House Commission on American History, or White House Conference on American History, was being conducted. And at the level of scholarship between the 1619 Project and the people who participated on the panel and the Library of Congress was simply not in the same universe. But I mean, you have a panel on American history that is composed entirely of white people, with the exception of Ben Carson, who, I feel a little sorry for Ben Carson, because he's like, I mean, this is sort of indicative. He's the most senior Black official in American politics, and even he doesn't get hired to do the job he's qualified for. Like, he's chairing a panel on American history. The guy's a neurosurgeon.
I never thought of it like that. Wow,
And John
that's
Hopkins,
sad.
yes, of all
sad.
places.
Going from HUD to,
Right.
like, oh, Ben, why don't you do the history thing, because you're the Black guy. And
That's so sad.
And so it's like he keeps being put in these positions he's completely not. But anyway, to me, this is like extremely worrying, because this is now, American history is now openly the subject and the tool of the federal government. Like, and I find it really ironic that this event was all, full of speeches against the influence of federal government of government into teaching curricula, and yet it was an event sponsored by the White House. Like, there's a profound disconnect going on here, but it does get to this resistance, like, at how hard that this kind of knee-jerk sort of reaction to any any sort of questioning or interrogation of the received version of American history that Black and white students for generations have received. And unlearning that is hard enough as it is. It's doubly hard when you have the federal government deciding against you if that's what you're, if you want a more honest and fuller picture, and frankly, more interesting picture of American history.
Yeah, like I feel like they're trying to paint a picture that if you criticize anything the founding fathers did, you don't love America. And it's and that puts you in a bad spot, because I saw a tweet once that was so powerful. It was like, or I don't know if it was a tweet or not, but it said, "I love America. That's why I criticize her perpetually." Like, that's why you criticize and look at, because yeah, it doesn't mean that you don't love it. And I think just kind of planting those seeds, like you can't say anything bad about the way this country was founded or some of the things we have going on now, because that's anti-American, and that gets into dangerous territory. We're a democracy. We're not. We should be able to look at some things and change going forward. So it's very dangerous type of rhetoric they're putting out.
Yeah. It's also interesting that of all the people that had on that particular panel, everyone was addressing the subject of the American founding. Like that's where, as if that's the battleground in trying to solidify this ideal of the purity of the motives of the American founding. But the great disservice that does to every student of history, whether professional or amateur, is that's not the whole of American history. I mean, in my own experience, when I learned relatively recently about the reality of Reconstruction, that and Jim Crow, I mean, it never really made sense to me from given my high school education and even what little, I don't think I had history courses in college, but from like the emancipation to the civil rights movement, you had 100 years where, wait, I thought slavery was abolished. You can never make sense of what went wrong because the story is extremely unflattering to American self-understanding. It's a contradiction of the America's story of itself, which is partly perhaps why it's never taught, or until recently. But it's just interesting that part of this American story does not make it into an official presentation about, American history as a whole. I'm sorry, I'm going off a little bit on a rant on this subject, but
no, you're okay. I like to tell people American history goes Revolutionary War, yay, independence, Civil War, oh, we came together, Martin Luther King.
yeah.
Now, that's it. I mean,
Exactly.
and all the middle is just conveniently left out. And I think Dr. Brian Mitchell talks about that on one of our podcasts, Pete, to your point. Yeah. Like he breaks down Reconstruction. He breaks down kind of what were some of the things that happened literally in that in-between space before you get to the civil rights movement, right? Because that's where a lot of the framework and the foundations were set, obviously, that set people off to then fuel the civil rights movement. And then there's a big gap, I believe, as a historian, between the civil rights movement and now. Mm-hmm. Like, I think people are kind of like, civil rights happened, Reagan in the 80s, Barack Obama. Yeah. Like that would be my new updated version. And it's like, that's not it, y'all. There's so much.
Yeah. Or even the history of terms, like, or the freight of language around these issues. Like I hear some people talk about, certain sections of the Republican electorate describing themselves as the silent majority without, or maybe with, I don't know, a sense of like the history of that term and like what that term denotes to Black Americans as opposed to what it suggests to white Americans, which are two totally different things. But again, there's not yeah, we had the Civil Rights Act. So what more do we need to do? um, but
well, we got Barack Obama after
yeah,
that,
we
so
got,
then we're done.
Right. We don't need a Voting Rights Act
It just,
anymore either.
we got
Everything's
it,
good
so
now.
we're good.
exactly. Problem solved. The title of the essay portion, the write-up for the episode with Brian Mitchell, is how an understanding of the past led to a brighter future. So how do you think, a frank and honest confrontation with the American past, in the way that I think we've all been sort of gesturing towards, as opposed to simply just reestablishing the myth, how do you think that leads us all to a more a hopeful place, and not just a more despairing one, perhaps?
Yeah. I think for me, it just gives us permission to know that the things we're experiencing now, a lot that has happened before, like, the history repeats itself adage that we always hear. I think, can y'all hear that? That's my, anyway. That just makes me feel more hopeful, because, like, Kara mentioned Dr. Angie Maxwell's book, and like she quotes someone, that very first line in the introduction, there's a quote that was like, the South didn't become Republican, the Republican Party became Southern. And like, just that simple line helped me better understand, like, why, like, because I would be confused, like, why do we vote like this? Why is this so, what's happening? Like, just knowing that history just helps you understand the now, and then you can kind of know what needs to be done to change it, or like even though like it could take decades to change. And I think, to me, I just feel more hopeful, because like, when you're not alone, that other people have done this stuff before under worse conditions. I think, to me, that gives me hope, because, when I say this, I think it's the current partisan climate and everything. Just knowing that what we're experiencing now is results of decades of decisions that were being made. So when you know that, you can go back and fix it, because you're like, okay, it happened with this, so let's educate people about this. I think, and that's the role I think we could play as a podcast, is the education piece. And we're not historians. I'm really not. Kara has a background in history, at least, but like, I think just knowing that stuff is empowering. Like, just knowing why things are the way they are, and that it doesn't always have to be this way, because they became this way.
I remember a moment like that when I learned that the Georgia, growing up in Georgia, just with the I always assumed the state flag had a Confederate flag in it. Just, well, it's that way, therefore it's always been that way, which is a really dumb way to think, but I was young and ignorant. But then I learned, maybe in my 20s or 30s, that it was only in 1956 when they put the Confederate flag portion in, and that things, I think I don't know what part of the human psyche, likes to believe that things are the way they are for a kind of necessary reason, but that they don't have to be that way. In fact, they weren't always that way, but they, as you just said, Kara, the decisions were made that led to those realities, and therefore, in theory at least, they can be undone or done differently. I want to ask you one thing about the character of your, we could talk about this subject all day, I think, about history, and like what real benefit there is to knowing this stuff. But I want to ask you, since I'm looking at the clock a little bit out of my left eye, my good eye. You, in your podcast and in your writing, are lift up Black lives that we wouldn't likely hear about in bigger media. So Black men and women in the South who are, working for, outside of what we think of as, or what we're trained to think of as just like the Black causes, like voting rights and stuff like that. Men and women who are working for opportunity, increased opportunities in terms of entrepreneurship and that sort of thing. But you also, so there's this kind of apologia for Black lives and celebration of them. But there's also this celebration of the South. And like I can tell from listening to you both, it sounds like you really love the South. You really love this region. There's something about it that is like, almost, is really worth celebrating and kind of geeking out over a little bit sometimes. And this is the way I wanted to kind of put this to you, because if a deep love for the South to me seems to animate Blackbelt Voices. And sometimes it feels difficult to really celebrate the South. And maybe this is a white thing, I don't know, but maybe it feels difficult to celebrate the South for its virtues when its vices are so apparent and often horrifying. The South has given Black Southerners so many reasons to despise and even abandon the South. But what Blackbelt Voices does, in part, in my experience is to highlight the fact that so much of the possibility and hope of the region can be found in the stories of those Black Southerners who had every reason to despise and leave the South behind, yet did not, stayed in order to love it into a better future. So can you talk a little bit about this, maybe the balance here of love of a region, and maybe this is related to what we were just talking about the knowledge of history and its relationship or proportional relationship to hopefulness for the future. The balance between understanding a region in its complexity, but frankly, terrible history, and loving it in spite of that. Does that make sense? I mean, I feel, well, I want to hear your response to that, and then I'll jump in.
Well, I see hopeful moments across the South happening. For example, I think that we've seen this surge of Black mayors happening. Certainly here in Little Rock, Mayor Frank Scott, in Jackson, Mississippi, and Shreveport, Louisiana, and Birmingham, Alabama. I think they, recently, like within the last year or two, Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta. So I think, to me, that signals something. I think it signals, one, people across the South coming to a like reconciliation or understanding that we have to have folks of all walks of life leading and helping to guide us moving forward into the future. And that may be very Pollyanna-ish of me, but that's the way I'm framing it. And also in my head, kind of see that as a referendum of what's happening on the federal level. So I think there's some local unease with what we may be doing nationally that makes people say we need to figure out a better way to do it here in the South. And I will tell you, as someone who lived up north for a little bit, and I lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and I will tell you, I mean, we all know here on the call, I mean, Baltimore is one of the most segregated cities I've actually ever lived in. So for me, it's about recognizing that we have challenges across the country and that I want the South to be better because I know we have the ability to be better. And part of that, again, is starting with that reconciliation of what has happened, right? So when I see people, like when I see the monuments, the lynching monument that is in, is it in Alabama, Adena? You went to it. I see that as places who never would have thought about this 20, 30 years before, someone saying, no, this is serious and we need to talk about this. And if we can't talk about this, then there's no way we're going to be able to do what we need to do to move the South forward. So for me, there are little things that I see that are happening that help me feel comfortable about being a Black person who's living in the South, seeing people recognize our history and being open about it. Because I think for so long it was like, let's not talk about it. It's not appropriate. And that was what, in my opinion, was holding us back, right? It was the fact that if you can't even deal with your issue, there's no way you're going to be, or confronted, there's no way you're going to be able to move forward. So I don't know if that answered your question, but there are little things that I see happening that I think are helping the South be more progressive. And there are things that I see that are making the South more regressive. So let me be sure to always put that nugget on there. But I do see some like spigots of hope.
Yeah, and I what Kara said about the federal level, I think that's what helped me, like seeing that it's not just the South. I think that helped me feel better about the South because, like, I always mention Charleston in 2015 because that was a really pivotal moment for me. Because, like, you know, at that time, Black Lives Matter was already happening. You know, Trayvon Martin had already happened with George Zimmerman. So of course I was paying attention, but it felt a little more foreign to me, you know, than sitting in a church because that's all we do as in my family. You know, that's we do a lot of that. So what really got me there was the response to that moment. Like, if you remember, the Confederate flag debate and the monument debate happened after 9 Black people were shot in the church by white supremacists. And then the conversation became about Confederate monuments. And that's what really angered me. And then I would tell people at work, I was like, I got to get out of here. Like, I have to leave this place. Like, I can't live here anymore. And my family's been here for generations. You know, Grandma Classy's lived in that same plot of land for all of her life. So I have deep roots here. And I think, I mean, of course, there's family who's moved off, but there's just something, I just didn't want to stay here. But then once I saw that it's not just here, like there's racism and stuff everywhere. So why not try to make my part of the world better? And I think that's where, like, so even though I didn't have the idea for Black Belt then, just the wheels were turning about, like, I think I craved connection and belonging too. So I wanted to connect with people who felt the way I did, whether they were white or Black or whatever, but who had that who wanted the South to be better, but still loved it, kind of like that relative that, you know, that no one else better talk bad about that relative, but like you can, but no one else better say anything bad about them. That's how I feel about the South. So when it's criticized from people outside the South, I get angry. But so the connection was a big thing for me. So that's why I started following Bitter Southerner and Scalawag magazine, and of course connecting with, you know, the Black publications. But so yeah, so now I feel like just when you see more people like those of you on this call who like care about the South, but who want to see it kind of shake some of that, you know, that reputation it has, and even just like that inferiority complex that we have as a region that comes across in yourself. So it's like, I don't love my voice, you know, but it's like I'm Black, I'm Southern, that's the way I sound. So it's kind of like just being okay with that and being proud of where you're from and just not shying away from it like we've been taught to. Like you have to change your voice and you have to not eat these certain foods because that's country or whatever. I'm just trying to embrace more of that because I do love it. It's kind of like America. You love it, but then you just want to criticize and henpeck it until it's it's better.
Yeah, if you don't love it, then you have no reason to complain about it, I suppose, or desire it to be better. All right, I'm gonna turn the tables on you a little bit because, and I think this will address what we've just been talking about, but you have a segment in your podcast that reflects your experience in the church, as you just mentioned, called the call and response segment. And you put a few questions to each of your guests. So I want to ask you the same questions you've asked to your guests on the podcast. So
I'm so excited because I didn't even thought about these.
Huh?
I hadn't even thought about these for myself, really. So I'm excited.
Okay.
Kara, come on.
Do you need to? You want me to give you a moment of quiet reflection?
No, we can do this.
So y'all can just jump in, whoever wants to go first. What do you wish people knew or understood about the South?
I think that we are the reason why America, I mean, we are that cultural fabric of America. Like some of the things we love about this country are because of the South. And as Sierra from Scalawag said on the podcast episode, what they say at Scalawag is that the South is wherever Black people are. So people who love Black culture, that's a lot of that has Southern roots. So yeah, the South is pretty cool.
So kind of to contradict her, I mean, the South is where Black people are, but I do wish people had a better understanding of the South being a culture, not a geographic footprint necessarily. So when I go places and people are like, well, yeah, Texas, it's in the South. Yes, it is, but parts of Texas are completely different than the way we do things. Vice versa, I wish people knew that like Arkansas is not Kansas and it's not in the Midwest.
No, it's not.
And that's a completely different culture as well. So.
If you could change one thing about the South, what would it be?
I think it would be our resistance to change. Like just being more open to different people, different ideas, and realize that, I mean, we are worth fighting for. We don't have to sell ourselves short. You know, politicians should pay attention to us down here. You know, we can have cool things too.
I wish people would see, this is going to be controversial, so I'm just going to say it and leave it. I'm going to drop the mic and leave it. I wish people would see the Civil War and the Confederacy as segregating from the country, not just the Black-white issue, but like people should be not supporting that because it's about leaving the United States. That's what so I wish people would see it more that way instead of just framing it in a Black-white issue, which it is, but it's a bigger issue that should make us all rethink the way that we, instead of having Southern pride for it, it's like, you shouldn't be prideful that you've left the United States. We should not be celebrating that. So.
Okay. Who would you sip sweet tea on the front porch with? Or rather, you would sip sweet tea on the front porch with fill in the blank. Who would you most like to?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch. Like I love deep conversations with people. Like I think that's that introvert I was telling you about. Like, yeah, like stuff like this is great. So I think Brene Brown, uh, along with Austin Channing Brown, no relation, but like the two of them together in conversation, and then me listening and chiming in. Yeah, of course historical figures, but like right now those two. I'm trying to think of more like. I just learned so much from them, listening to them. Like Austin Channing Brown has experience, like working with racial reconciliation, the Black church and white churches too. And we all know Brene Brown is great. So, oh yeah, Kimberly Foster too. She's over for Harriet. So the four of us just sitting there sipping sweet tea and talking about feminism and faith and race and stuff. Sounds great.
I'm going to be real simple. My grandma, my great grandma, and my great 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 grandma, because I like to hear firsthand stories, and they actually have very interesting stories. My grandma is still alive, and so some of the things that I learned from her are just fascinating because it reminds me that a lot of these, she's still alive and she experienced a lot of the things that happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So
maybe we'll see her on the podcast season 2.
she has a mouth that I don't know. She has earned her way to say what she wants and will not be edited.
It will not be a live.
It's not always nice.
Not a live podcast.
No.
What is your favorite Black or Southern saying?
Oh, bless her heart, because it's the best kind of shade. It's like, oh, you're sad, but it's our way of being like, oh, you sad person. Oh.
That's a good one. I like name one of y'all. Like I say that a lot, like, hey, name one of y'all. I like that a lot. Just as a way to say something. And something else I always say, I can't even think about it, but like just saying words in a certain way a lot of times, it may not be the word, but just the way I say it. Like my uncle say and so I like saying instead of like I say so like just little things like that I just like.
I'm gonna have to use that one. Okay, this may be the most important one of all. What is your favorite soul food?
I like smothered pork chops. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. I would like to change I like catfish. And you know why? Because when I lived in Baltimore, catfish was like the nasty fish, right? They don't eat that up there. You have to go to a specialty market to get it because they're like, that's not tilapia. Why would I eat that? So every time I would come home, I'd be like, Mom, can you just make me catfish? That's all I want.
Fried, I assume.
Yes. Well, I'll eat it anyway.
Well,
but yeah.
Is there any other way?
Catfish is a good one. And like if I have the catfish meal with Kara, hush puppies hush puppies are like my favorite thing. And in that same vein, fried okra, I guess, because some guests have recently said fried okra, which I forgot all about. But it can't be too perfect. Like none of that little bagged, perfectly round fried okra with the breading that you can just peel off. Like the kind that's all clumped together. It's my favorite kind.
I haven't eaten lunch yet, but now I'm going to be disappointed with whatever it is I have. It's not going to be fried okra, sadly. It's getting to be close to 1:30, 1:20 now. I want to throw out, as we kind of wrap up here, since we're talking about food, there's a quote from Chris Jones from your Talent Needs Opportunity episode that I just thought was so great, and I wanted to throw it out there, which is a great episode, by the way. It was one of those episodes where this is the sort of thing you don't hear on anywhere else, really, or few other places. He said this on the podcast: people who really want to make a difference in the world are like charcoal on a barbecue grill. You can have one coal that is on fire, lit, but if it's sitting alone in a corner, it will die out. the only way you can sustain the heat is to pile the charcoal together. Some of us are wood chips, and some of us are big charcoal blocks. And I love this image for thinking about, like, even, what we're doing now, or what we all can leave here and go do in our own communities, as being like charcoal, that burning together, we are stronger and hotter. And that is such a great image. I'm going to use that one in the future. So thank you for that. And thank Chris Jones.
Please don't give Chris any more
Really?
credit than what he
Okay.
needs.
All right.
He's a Morehouse man. He's going to take that and run with
gotcha.
it.
Understand.
Oh, that is good stuff, though.
It is.
Because when he said it, it was great, but like just hearing it repeated like that, it's like, yeah, that's some powerful stuff, Chris. Good job.
And Chris really is wonderful. And to underscore your point, Pete, I mean, it takes all kinds. It takes John, working behind the scenes or maybe out front in political ways. It takes us doing podcasts. It takes you all, Sam and Matt, being here and showing up for the conversation. So, and that's how we get things changed and moved.
I have loved talking to you both. This has been so great. And I hope we get to do this on the front porch with some sweet tea at some point.
Yeah.
But I also, I feel like it's just inspiring being in the same room with you, and to feel like we're all part of this same charcoal fire. I feel like and so much of the love and the passion that animates Blackbelt Voices, is I feel that here today. And so I hope we will all have a chance to do this again.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, since they're only Matt and Sam, I follow Adena and Kara on It's Blackbelt Voices, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, the website, if you're not already. So, and please share that with your friends. I know how important it is to hit the 5 stars button on a podcast. So go.
Yeah, which I think because of some of our topics don't always get a 5-star.
Oh, our average is like
quality.
3.9.
I think it's more like you're making us talk about things we don't want to hear about. You're rank you a little lower. So
we got our first 1-star. Like, of course, we had 5 stars at the beginning because we didn't have, we just only friends listen. But then we got our first 1-star from random folks, and I was like, that little 1-star bar went a little long once Apple featured us. I'm like, okay, these are just haters, maybe. And if they have a problem, they can comment. But anyway,
Russian bots.
Yeah,
that's what it is. Exactly.
So, on a final note, what should we look forward to for season 2, which you've just launched? What's coming up?
We have our next few episodes leading to the election will be very political focused. But after the election, we hope to talk about. We have self-care on there, maybe something about student loans and how that relates to race, food, hopefully a food episode coming up, barbecue and all that good stuff. So we'll probably get a little lighter after the election, but now it's kind of like, vote, get registered, and then we're social justice will come up in an episode, racism in the media and bias, but then we may get back to our more fun, like hair, interior design type topics, so.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like we're all preparing for final exams right now, and it's like we're just looking forward to senior trip after it's all over. Just talk about something else for a little bit. But
no matter the outcome, hopefully we can just kind of do something fun. But who knows? Everything's crazy, so.
It is, but thank you for the work that you're doing. It's been a huge benefit to me. I've learned so much, and I'm looking forward to what's coming soon, and the next month is going to be very interesting, so I think we'll all be tuning in to what you guys are offering. So Adena, Kara, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, Matt, Sam, and John, thanks for being here too.
Great meeting. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Pete, for inviting us.
Soon. Okay.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
All right. Bye.